dashing showgirl? Was the dancing years the last waltz for Molly Mazel? Scandal at number 10. Did corruption in high places lead to murder not once, but twice? Was an innocent person accused, or did someone quite literally get away with murder? Hello, I'm Edward Woodward. Tonight I am taking you on another journey into the past. This time we are investigating the perfect murder. A crime which not only leaves a question mark over who did it, but whether a crime was in fact committed at all. We have two people who disappeared, but no bodies were ever found. Another who died suddenly, but no cause of death was ever established. Three suspected crimes, three suspected perfect murders. Of course, as these are true stories, there is no perfect solution. January the 14th, 1949, started like any other day in the theatre for Molly Mazel, assistant stage manager with a touring production of Ivor Novello's hit musical, The Dancing Years.
Morning, Fred. It's Parky today. Letter for you here, Molly.
We'll never know what was in that letter awaiting her at the Sunderland Empire, but we do know that she was about to step into a mystery which to this day affects the lives of all who knew and loved her.
She went out of the theatre on Friday, and we just don't know where she's gone from there. People in the company, in the theatrical company, said she hadn't had a quarrel with anybody. She just left them on the Friday afternoon, gone out to post letters, and that was it.
But there was no hint of the tragedy to come as the cast collected their wages that day.
Some of us have to wait a bit longer.
Way, and it's all right to them. It's not stop at tea time.
Hey, can you not take me on, Molly? Leading man or something like that?
You're too handsome, Arthur. There's no house that'd cope with the crowds.
Listen, do you think you could lend us a tart, Pet?
Of course we can, dear. Don't spend it all at once. See you in the Dun Cow at dinner.
Molly was a real trooper, the sort who readily listened to other people's troubles, but hid her own fears behind a cheerful smile. And Molly did have problems. Her life was starting to fall apart. Molly wasn't always a backstage girl. Since she'd left home for show business at the age of 14, she'd appeared at theatres all over Britain as an actress, dancer, and singer. In serious plays and variety, pantomimes and comic routines. Molly had talent but hadn't quite made it to the top, although the married man she'd been in love with for 16 years was a star.
Where have you been? I told you. Giggled with.
Bunny Doyle, one of England's top comedians, in his day as popular and loved as Morecambe and Wise or Tommy Cooper. He plucked Molly from the chorus line when she was just 16, and he was more than twice her age. For the next 16 years, Molly was part of his top-of-the-bill routine, his stooge. Offstage, she was the love of his life.
Easy Kickle Market, have you, love? Hey, I'm plumb cheap.
Hey, and I tell you what, missus, the Minister for Idiotic Affairs is looking into Giggleswick. Ah, there's been reports.
Playing tiddlywinks with manhole covers. I'm plumb cheap.
Molly came from the respectable middle classes. Her family ran a wholesale fruit and vegetable business in Liverpool. Molly's brother Joe adored his talented little sister. She kept in touch and wrote home regularly. As a girl, Molly's mother sang so well that her teachers wanted her to get a professional training. Her father, however, would not allow this. Now Mary had a daughter on the stage, and she was delighted. in the eyes of both, Molly could do no wrong. Even if it meant living with Bunny, a married man.
Bye, Mrs. Hudson. Hello. What's a nice girl like you doing, hanging around on street corners? And plums cheap. How about you?
Get in, you Burke, we'll be late.
Bunny lived apart from his wife. They never divorced. This was 20-odd years before the permissive society. Yet Bunny and Molly's relationship was never frowned upon at home. Indeed, Molly rarely came home without him.
Daddy! Dad! Auntie Molly's here and Bunny. They're in the funeral wagon.
Nay then, lass, this is a built-up area. I shall have to report you. Miss Wraith pipes up from the back seat. I'm from the Ministry of Idiotic Affairs, Constable. I'm a plum's chief. Honestly, you should have seen the poor Bobby's mush. He only went and asked for our autograph.
Did you give it him?
Did we? I'd have ended up being made to walk a straight line.
What do you mean, Molly? Walk a straight line?
To the gallows, lad.
Oh, Dana noticed Frankie's an idiot. Bananas, Pat, I don't believe it.
If only this domestic bliss had continued, perhaps Molly would be here today.
Don't you like them, Bunny?
I've forgotten what they look like, lad. Hey, what would you do with something like this?
Not in front of the nippers, Mr. Doyle. Isn't he awful?
But Bunny wasn't the marrying kind.
I don't think my father could ever be true to one woman at a time. Although he loved Molly, he still had his roving eye. And I think Molly got very fed up because he would not settle and get married. But I think towards the end he was going to marry her because he'd phoned me up and asked me to ask my mother if he could get a divorce. But nothing else. He just sort of dithered until she got fed up, and that was it.
By now, Molly was 32 and still unmarried, which in those days would have placed her firmly on the shelf. She had devoted her personal and professional life completely to Bunny. But as she watched him eyeing the younger dancers, perhaps, who knows, she began to want the security of a wedding ring. Anyway, she told friends that she had fallen for someone else. It wasn't the deep love that she had shared with Bunny, she said, but he was a man who had promised her marriage and security. Walter Attersley, boxing promoter, garage owner, licensee of the Alexander Hotel, Sheffield, where civic bigwigs and policemen rub shoulders with villains. A self-made man, worth £500,000 at today's prices, he bullied one son into marriage and another into boxing. The Alex, his hotel, was just around the corner from this theatre, and performers often stayed there.
I don't think you've met Molly. Miss Molly Moselle. Waller, gin and lime for Molly.
Nay, you've never seen anybody box like Johnny Cuthbert. You'll remember him, Joe. What a fighter.
Molly took her new love home to Liverpool for an engagement celebration. Her family welcomed Walter, although he was never to become as close to them as Bunny had been.
Well, the fight should have fixed up for him if he'd have carried on as his trainer. I think my favourite boxer's Randolph Turpin, though. I fixed a few bouts for him up at Hillsborough.
Did he get married?
You know, they're good boxers, they've got quick reflexes, you know, they think that they're really good counters.
How much they cost?
Joe, did you ever hear of Jimmy McKenna?
200.
200? Well, I once saw him deck Italian at a fairground in
It's quite
Doncaster.
valuable for me to wear.
Hey, did you ever hear of Gus Platt, Joe? Not from Sheffield, Rotherham lad.
Oh, don't be such a bore, Walter. We
don't want to hear about best old boxing, do we, Frankie?
Oh, so this is your young fan then?
She's followed my career since she was this big, haven't you, Frank?
Yeah, and Bunny Doyle's too.
The legend of Bunny Doyle would, it seemed, haunt Molly forever.
Come and get Walter another drink, Frank. That's a dear. Walter knows a couple of chaps from Sheffield Market, Joe.
A year passed by, and Molly and Hattersley were no nearer the altar. There had been talk of marriage, there had been an engagement party, but there were no firm plans, no date had been set, and Hattersley's sons opposed the match. Did Molly realize the relationship was going wrong? Perhaps she was secretly pining for the tender love she had shared with Bunny. Perhaps she had begun to see the darker side of Walter Hattersley's character.
What the bloody hell do you think you're playing at?
Dancing.
I mean downstairs in my bar. All this when we get married for our honeymoon business. Don't call me that. I'll decide what they know, not you.
Get me another one, there's a dear.
You've had enough. You're pining after him, aren't you? Bunny bloody Doyle.
I know.
And if you want him, go and find him. You can clear out! That's what the lads want.
I want you, Wally. I want us to be married. You promised and we haven't even bought a ring.
We'll have that muck off for a start.
Waltz with me.
Stop your damn nonsense!
I'm sorry, Walter. I am really. Can't we have another try?
Molly, Molly.
But it was over. A final letter from Hattersley arrived on the morning of her disappearance. Nobody knows what was in the letter, but we know that Hattersley later told the police there had never been an engagement, he'd never bought her a ring, and that she'd made the whole thing up. Perhaps Molly finally realized that she'd picked the wrong man.
Try to talk to Walter. I've written. Got a letter from him today.
Don't upset yourself, pet.
No, Arthur, you're right.
Yeah, there's plenty more fish in the sea.
More pebbles on the beach.
Aye, no, that's the spirit, Bunny laugh. Hey, the show must go on.
I think I'll go and have a look around the shops.
Ah, you'll do that. Go and give yourself a treat.
Molly did go shopping and returned to her digs near the Empire in the late afternoon. The following day was her sister Gertrude's birthday. It was also leading man Barry Sinclair's. Now, Molly never forgot birthdays, but neither of them received a card, and Molly Moselle was never seen again.
I said to my children, Auntie Molly hasn't sent me a birthday card. But I didn't really think anything of it because I thought she'd either been too busy or else, being a Saturday, it hadn't been delivered and would come on the Monday. But, of course, no card ever came from her because she can't have posted them.
You can imagine how much publicity the case got. Pretty girl, showbiz background, what seemed a glamorous lifestyle in those austerity days when you still needed ration coupons to buy a bar of chocolate. I remember it, well, just. Molly's disappearance started a massive police search. Plainclothes detectives kept watch just in case anyone should come looking for her. Rumour has it that the police raised the floorboards inside the Empire and boarded ships leaving port. But there was no trace of Molly Moselle. The police clearly suspected suicide or murder, but there was no note and no body.
We've never really thought that she took her own life. We've wondered if it is a port, Sunderland. We've wondered whether she was Shanghai, taken off on a ship or something like that. And, well, it's just a mystery. We just don't know what happened.
The cast of the Dancing Years didn't believe it was suicide either. They feared that Molly had been kidnapped and shipped abroad for white slave trade. Bunny thought that she had staged her own disappearance.
He said, oh, she's just doing that for a game so that I'll go running after her. And when she comes back, we'll get married. He said, but this time I will get married when she comes back because it's frightened me, her running off like that. I remember that very clearly. Yeah, and he said, oh, he said, no, he said, she'll come back to me. And he waited all that time.
Well, it affected my mother very, very much because it was 6 years after my dad died. And I remember her saying, I'm just getting over losing your dad, and now this has happened. And I think it was even worse than losing my dad, because at least she knew where my dad was buried, in McGill churchyard, and, well, she didn't know where Molly was.
12 years after Molly disappeared, the badly decomposed body of a woman was found in the River Wear. Forensic tests showed she had been between 25 and 50, and 5 feet 3 inches tall. Molly was 5'6". But then, of course, the body was headless. Anyway, the police file remains open.
I was very upset for a long time, and as my daughter said, we were talking last night, well, she said, it's always there, Mum, that you've lost your sister. And something will trigger it off again, that you realise you haven't got her anymore. You can't talk to her or ask her how she is or anything like that.
Bunny Doyle never believed Molly was dead. 6 years after her disappearance, he died suddenly in Blackpool, calling out her name. In his will, he left Molly, my partner, for many years, a third of his estate and his old Buick sedan car. But in spite of nationwide publicity, Molly never came forward to collect her inheritance. It could be said that Molly's disappearance was the death of Bunny.
No, he never gave up hope. That's why he left the will intact as it was, because he went very downhill, always hoping, always hoping. It was very, very sad.
Molly's brother Joe didn't give up hope either. He continued to search for his favourite sister, and he asked the Salvation Army if they could possibly trace her. They said that if Molly was alive, she certainly was not in Great Britain. Police inquiries cleared the characters in our story from any involvement in Molly's disappearance. So could someone else have abducted her? In those days, of course, Sunderland was indeed a very busy port. You know that if Molly Moselle was still alive today, she would be 75 years old. I suppose we'll never know what happened to her. Unless, of course, after all these years, she steps from the wings to end the mystery herself. In our next story, a sinister disappearance and a sudden death. Was one person responsible for both mysteries? September evening in 1920. A painter sees two men crossing the Thames to Ditton Island, aboard what was charmingly called an electric canoe. One of them, a chap he'd once known rather well. He felt he couldn't pass up the opportunity to renew his acquaintance with an interesting and unusual man, so he had himself ferried across.
I do hope you'll excuse me. We've not been introduced, but I believe you have a visitor who happens to be an old friend of mine, Victor Grayson. He once sat for me. I painted his portrait. I am a painter, you see. I don't mean to intrude, but we've lost touch, you see. Perhaps you could give him my card.
I'm very sorry, Mr. Flemwell. There's no Mr. Grayson here, or anybody else you might know. We do not welcome casual callers. That is why we live on an island. Good night.
Flemwell was sure that he'd made no mistake, but he also knew Grayson was a man of affairs. So he drew the obvious, slightly embarrassed conclusion, and he left. The woman and the other man he did not know, but we do. A man called Maundy Gregory. Maundy Gregory had an electric canoe, a bungalow on Ditton Island called Vanity Fair, and a strange, handsome lady for a tenant. And he was certainly acquainted with Victor Grayson. Maundy Gregory was acquainted with all sorts of people. Prime ministers, royalty, spies, blackmailers, and a disproportionately large number of people whose names appeared in the honours list. The woman was a former small part actress called Edith Rossi. Maundy Gregory called her Milady. She called him Uncle Jim. We can, however, only speculate on their relationship, not wife, probably not mistress. The best description for her was victim. 3 people on an island. One who died, one who disappeared, and one whose days ended in exile.
The worth of your labor, the value of your work.
Grayson was born in Liverpool, poor but clever. He set out to be a missionary, a course that gave him some education.
You see plenty of
However, he became a politician instead.
money, and you don't see it at all. Socialism, my friend.
Call yourself a bloody socialist? Look at you, all dressed up like a lady draper's window.
I wish you wouldn't threaten me with that bottle, friend. Waste a good bottle. Go and break a few of the Tory paymasters' heads with it. Empty it first, by all means. I'll help you if you like, but do something useful with it. And don't make the mistake of thinking socialism means nobody gets a good suit. The whole idea of socialism is you get a good suit. Though how it'll look on you, I can't say.
He won the Colne Valley seat as an independent socialist in 1907. For a revolutionary, however, he was something of an oddity. He preached the overthrow of the old order, all right, but like as not, he'd be wearing evening dress at the time. He took naturally enough to champagne.
I used to be a member here.
By the time he lost his seat 3 years later, the promising politician had become a drunkard.
Evening!
Perhaps he was glad to enlist and go to war as a private soldier. It was, I suppose, a nobler fate than being a drunken bankrupt. Honorably wounded, he survived the war. What broke him was that his wife did not. In 1917, she died in childbirth. The other man in the canoe had done rather better over the years.
Oh, yes. Once upon a time, I was an actor.
Maundy, my dearest, we We just don't have to go to the theatre to enjoy the splendor of your performance.
But if one has a talent in that direction, I think it's a criminal waste to confine it to the theatre. It's so much more useful and profitable in the real world. I produce in the West End. In a way, I'm still a producer. I arrange for people to play the parts they wish to play in life. And people are awfully eager to play the good parts. Aren't they, milady?
Awfully eager.
Mr. Gregory, sir, there is a telephone call, please.
Oh, tell them.
It's from number 10.
Ah. In that case, would you excuse me? Bring my honoured guest another bottle of the pepper. He spent a long time looking for a house with just that address before he moved into number 10. Number 10, Hyde Park Terrace, which his staff were instructed always to call simply number 10. Very simple trick, isn't it? But it worked on you. Certainly worked on me.
Presented to him by the King of Green. Well, I knew he was well connected, but,
Well, the poor dear is exiled and needs friends in high places. He has another one, presented to him by the Duke of York. But I believe he keeps that for special occasions. Speaking of which, I believe congratulations are in order, or soon will be. Don't worry. I am the soul of discretion. I won't spoil a surprise for anybody.
The tenant at number 10 Downing Street at the time was Lloyd George. His political coffers were empty, and he'd hit on a not entirely novel method of filling them, selling honours. The Prime Minister could make men knights or lords. The kind of men, however, who bought these honours were the kinds of men who'd made fortunes out of the war. It just required a salesman, a tout, a fixer. And that was Maundy Gregory. It was not a very respectable trade. In fact, it was a scandalous trade. Although he'd lost his seat, Victor Grayson took up the cause with his old passion and anger undimmed. In a public speech in Liverpool, he said, "I declare this sale of honours is a national scandal. It can be traced right down from number 10 Downing Street to a monocled dandy with offices in Whitehall who organizes the greatest piece of political chicanery this country has known since the days of the rotten boroughs. I know this man," he said, "and one day I will name him." He was, of course, referring to Maundy Gregory. What followed may have been just a coincidence.
Good God. Did you go to the police?
The Charing Cross Hospital on the top of the night, but I reported it. Waste of time.
Not when you get beaten up in the street. Were they out to rob you?
They were out to do me harm.
Just louts. Drunk, do you think?
Louts, but not so drunk they couldn't follow instructions. People not on to frighten me. I think it's just frightening.
Oh. Victor.
Mr. Grayson, is it?
Yes, I'm great.
A message by telephone, sir, from the Queen's Hotel. They say your luggage has arrived.
Has it? Thank you. Don't let anybody touch my drink. I'll be back later.
But he didn't come back. His friend eventually telephoned the Queen's Hotel. They knew of no such telephone call, no such luggage, and they knew nothing whatsoever of a man called Victor Grayson. He put down his drink, and he disappeared. It was an evening in September. Now, whether it was the same evening that Flemwell the artist saw him is something of which we cannot be certain. However, we can be certain that Victor Grayson disappeared and was never seen again. Now, if the artist was not mistaken, we have to ask why Grayson would go with a man he loathed to an almost inaccessible island. Maundy Gregory was probably using blackmail. Gregory was a homosexual, and we know that Grayson had homosexual leanings, which left him in those days wide open to blackmail. Maundy Gregory collected useful information of that kind. In fact, he was so good at it that he'd run a ring of informers for MI5. And by the by, he made his headquarters in the Queen's Hotel, Leicester Square in London. Still, if Maundy knew of Grayson's fate, he had no explaining to do because nobody ever asked him. And if nobody else in Gregory's intimate circle had come to a mysterious end, it would be perhaps unfair to implicate Maundy Gregory. However, somebody else did come to an end, to a most peculiar end. 6 years after Victor Grayson's disappearance, Parliament passed an act making Maundy Gregory's speciality illegal. Not impossible, but illegal.
Champagne?
No. Over there.
Certainly, sir.
A chap who put £30,000 down in advance on a baronetcy inconveniently died before collecting. His heirs were not interested in a title that they couldn't have.
They want their money back.
Well, tell them to sue for it.
I'm rather afraid that they might.
Of course they won't. Sewing mailbags is a useful occupation, but an embarrassing one.
Two things about the dead. You can't libel them, and they're very difficult to embarrass.
No. The executors were quite prepared to go to law. And at the 11th hour, Maundy decided that he wasn't. He settled out of court. He agreed to pay back the $30,000 in 3 installments. The problem was that he was pushed for cash. He had a talent for spending it. The point is, he was also being blackmailed. He needed money.
I need 10,000, that's all.
Oh. I haven't got 10,000 to lend.
Oh, now, milady. Have I not been kind to you all these years? Have I not been generous?
Dear Uncle Jim, you've been frightfully generous. But then, on the other hand, I believe I've been very accommodating.
And can you not accommodate me in this little matter? I know you have it.
I'm sure you know to the penny how much I have. You know so many very personal details about so many people, Maundy. If you're pushed, it's time to draw on your savings.
What savings? What did I ever save?
You hoard other people's secrets, Maundy, and other people's secrets are worth money. Some people have plenty of both.
Hardly blackmail my friends.
We've never called it blackmail before. You persuade them that it is a very beautiful and noble gift for a very beautiful and deserving cause, which of course you are. They will think of it as Maundy money.
Wherever Edith's money came from, she was certainly going to hang on to it. Maundy, as we've heard, was something of a collector. Not only gossip and secrets, but the things that other people collect, like paintings and books. He'd collected some paintings by an artist called Wainwright, who was famous not only as a painter, but also as a poisoner. He is reputed to have committed the perfect murder 6 times over, using a poison which left no trace. Maundy Gregory had written an article about Wainwright and his poison. In fact, Maundy Gregory had had become an expert on the subject. He was lunching with the King of Greece when word came.
I hope your Majesty will excuse me. I've received some very grave news from number 10. I must beg your indulgence.
I don't know what's the matter with me. I do feel... I feel as though something's burst in my head.
Yes, I believe you have an inflammation of the kidneys, which you've aggravated with heat stroke. Stay in bed and take some aspirin.
Am I going to get better?
I should think so.
Bless you. Please. Fetch me some paper. I feel I want to make my will. Oh, please. Paper and a pen. I'll tell you what I want to say. Everything I have. If anything should happen to me, to be left to Mr. J. Maundy Gregory. To be disposed of as he thinks best. And in accordance with what I should desire.
Short and quite sweet. Classic Maundy Gregory. He was at home. Any amount of writing paper was surely only a few strides away. But the will was written on a menu card, recalling luncheon with a king. Always irresistible touch.
Doctor, would you... And
he called Dr. Plummer back twice more that day. From sunstroke, the diagnosis moved on to Bright's disease. It's a chronic affliction of the kidneys. Drinkers are susceptible. And Edith was very fond of drink. The doctor made 8 visits in as many days. She grew better. On September the 3rd, she was well enough to have dinner with Maundy Gregory in his room.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to manage all that.
an aperitif to sharpen your knife and fork. That's the thing. I prescribe champagne.
Why not? Now, you won't be taking telephone calls all evening. You'll keep me company.
Good lady. No telephone there. We are not at home.
Yes, sir.
It should have been a pleasant meal, but it marked a sudden relapse. Gregory called back Dr. Plummer. Wainwright's poison was Nux vomica. It's a seed from India, and it contains the poisons strychnine and brucine, and the effects are variable. Vomiting, diarrhea, drowsiness, numbness, mental confusion, convulsions, any of these or all of these. Edith Rossi had all of these. Now, Dr. Plummer certified cerebral hemorrhage and chronic Bright's disease, a combination of ills that could plausibly account for them as well, as indeed Wainwright could have told him. He could also have told the doctor that arsenic, for instance, will persist in human remains for hundreds, even thousands of years. Nux vomica, on the other hand, simply dissolves away in water.
As she was not of the parish, I'm afraid we're obliged to ask for
consideration. Of course. 100 guineas was mentioned to me. She loved the river so much.
It's a great deal of money, I know, but otherwise, you see, we'd be inundated.
This is where she would choose to lie. 100 guineas is no object.
Of course, the preferred plots are further up. During the winter, the graves down here are sometimes underwater entirely.
Oh. I believe that would rather please her. In the embrace of the water. I must have visited every churchyard on the bank of the Thames. But I have found it here. This is her resting place. Quite perfect.
£100 guineas to the parish coffers of Bisham bought her a grave close to the water's edge. On Maundy's precise instructions, she was buried shallow. The top of her coffin was just 18 inches down.
The lady was most insistent. She could never bear the idea of any great weight of earth bearing down on her.
Did she also insist on a coffin lined with lead? And was it her precise wish that the top of the lead coffin should not be sealed? Perhaps she didn't realize that such arrangements would leave her body steeping in a slowly changing bath of Thames water. 18,000 was useful, but Maundy Gregory was still up against it, still trying to squeeze what he could from the trade he knew. He thought he'd found a mark in a retired naval man and tried him with a knighthood for 10,000. The sailor wasn't biting.
I really think you ought to consider again more fully. It's very awkward, you see. The matter has almost been completed. I know 10,000 is a considerable sum, but the sinews of war, you know, are required to open certain doors. It would not be required all at once. Could you not agree to let me have 2,000 as an advance? I really think you ought to talk it over again with your wife.
Maundy Gregory hadn't done his homework. For one thing, Lieutenant Commander Edward Waney Billiard Leak, R.N. retired, wasn't as rich as Maundy Gregory thought. For another, he was that rare and dangerous creature, the upright citizen. And he went straight to the police. It must have become clear to Maundy Gregory that his friends in high places were more eager to retreat than to advance in his cause. He knew exactly which card to play in those circumstances.
Oh, you've heard I'm to plead not guilty. Well, nobody wants a whole train of witnesses dragged through the court and cross-examined. No. Well, what am I to do? Sacrifice myself?
An arrangement was made. It would be best for Maundy Gregory to go away in silence. Maundy Gregory changed his plea. The Tory party offered him 1,000 a year. A man could live twice as well on 2,000 a year in France in 1933, which is what he held out for, and got.
Excuse me, sir, I have a message for you.
But before he got it, he also got a £250 fine and 2 months without hard labour for contravening the Honours Prevention of Abuses Act. And as Maundy Gregory whiled away his 2 months, an aggrieved niece denied her expectations, persuaded Scotland Yard that her aunt's death may not have been quite natural. Now, before the police can dig up a body, they must have a warrant, issued by the Home Office. Scotland Yard applied not long after Maundy Gregory began his sentence. This was surely rather convenient. No chance of a suspect skipping the country before the evidence was in. But, oddly enough, there was a delay in issuing the warrant, and it had still not been issued on the 12th of April when Maundy Gregory came out of Wormwood Scrubs.
Gentlemen, this is a change. Oh, this is so good of you. And it's so awfully good to know that one has such friends.
someone going to open that champagne?
I was obliged to speak to some of the reporters outside and to tell them I'm going to spend a little time in the country. As you know, I cannot tell a lie. I merely omitted to tell them which country.
Assisted by these friends in high places, he went straight to Victoria, the boat train and exile. It was another 2 weeks before the Home Office were allowed to issue the exhumation order. The Home Office pathologist was there to see the exhumation. The grave had been under flood at least 3 times during the winter.
Not a chance. Not a chance.
And he was right. Examination found no trace of poison. It also found no trace of cerebral hemorrhage or Bright's disease. So, whatever caused her death, it was not what Dr. Plummer had put on the certificate. If there had been poison in the body, all trace of it would have been sluiced away by the waters of the Thames, the same river that possibly washed away all traces of Victor Grayson, and the same river that washed away all signs of corruption in high places. Maundy Gregory spent the rest of his life in exile in France, where he died in 1941 after being interned by the Nazis. None of his friends thought him capable of murder, but Scotland Yard remained convinced that he had poisoned Edith Rossi, although there was indeed no evidence. The River Thames had seen to that. Now, if the police were right, and he was capable of murdering Edith Rossi, his closest friend, was he not also capable of murdering his bitter enemy? The man who had threatened to expose him? Was Victor Grayson murdered, or did he just disappear? I suppose we will never know that for certain, just as we will never know for certain the fate of Molly Moselle. In her case, there was no prime suspect, just a certainty amongst everyone who knew her that she was incapable of suicide, or of causing such pain to her family by deliberately disappearing. So we can only conclude foul play, although by whom and why remains a mystery. I will be back soon with more true crimes committed in suspicious circumstances. Until then, good night to you all.